I was born in a small town in northern Michigan with about 100 people in it. I must be one of few members of my generation that went to a one-room school. There were 13 kids in 8 grades, 3 of whom were my cousins. Half of them, obviously, were girls, so that meant there were no organized sports. Everyone in the community hunted and fished and all that kind of thing. And then I went to high school to my great good fortune, what was then generally conceded to be the best public high school in the United States in a suburb of Chicago. The school was called New Trier. I was very much a backwoods kid, out of the water or out of the backwoods, and did not have a very happy time in that high school, totally ignorant of the fact that adolescents are never happy. I thought I was the only unhappy adolescent in the world, until I discovered the remarkable theater program the school had. Given my background in Michigan, I was, on top of the fact that at that age I was the smallest kid in my class. It's hard to believe, but true. And I was, the only activities I could qualify for were the rifle team and the chess club, and that doesn't make for a brilliant career in school. But then I discovered the theater program, and that absorbed me completely, as it has ever since. I had, as should fall to the lot of any kid, the happy exposure to 2 or 3 great teachers. The most significant was Elvina Krauss at Northwestern, who acquired something of a national reputation as an acting teacher. And at New Trier, I had a marvelous English teacher and a marvelous history teacher, and a pretty good painting teacher, too. But I think the history teacher was, his name was Mr. Shearer, and I revere his memory. He was the first one that began to make me understand that history, as Santayana said, is not only the most important subject, but maybe the only subject. I think all kids are instinctive actors. That's why so often a kid who has never done anything can be quite good in a play or a film. Kids play pretend games. That's part of being a kid. We all fantasize, depending on our personalities, throughout life. How wouldn't it be nice if? And living the rather isolated childhood I did, I probably did that more than most kids. I was always acting out the stories that I had read. Even the rather exciting and idyllic boy's life I led in the woods. If you're off hunting rabbits in the winter with your .22 and it's cold and your nose is running and you've got to keep one hand out of the mittens in case you actually see a rabbit, and you haven't seen a rabbit in 2 hours and your feet are getting cold through your boots, it's more interesting to pretend to be Davy Crockett hunting Comanches instead of a 10-year-old boy hunting rabbits. And I suppose now that I am an actor, acting is pretending to be other people. And fantasies are still a part of my life. Acting is statistically a profession at which you cannot make a living, of course. And I understood that. I had chosen professional acting as a way to make a living, as the theme of the 10,000-word essay every junior at New Trier High School had to produce by the end of the year. For a high school junior, a 10,000-word essay with footnotes and research is a formidable task. And I chose this acting as a profession, and the statistics indicate what any actor knows, that you really can't make a living acting, which did not daunt me at all. Acting is the process of being rejected. And finally the part comes along that you were right for on the day that you were there. And now that I'm often on the other end of the casting experience, it breaks my heart to see people reading for a part, and you can see their hands shaking, holding the pages, and you think, why are they doing this? He doesn't like this. It's awful for him. Why are we putting him through this ordeal? There are, on the other hand, very good actors who are very bad readers. I can only say that I always thought I would get every part I went up for. I was always amazed when I didn't get parts, when that's primarily what I spent my time doing for the first year, not getting parts. But certainly confidence is part of it, and somehow I always thought I would get it, which probably helped me. I just would shrug that off. To not get a part was an aberration on the part of the people who didn't give it to me. I don't mean that I went around shouting about it, but I just thought, well, can't understand that. I was a very difficult actor to cast by the time I got to New York. 6'3", broken nose, bass voice, and going up for juvenile roles. I'm not going to get those parts. And I sort of figured that out after a while, but I got smaller parts. Then I was understudying a lead in a play that they discharged the very good actor who was playing it, but he was the wrong actor. And then got bigger parts, and then live television was, of course, a blessing for me and 10 other actors and 3 actresses and 3 or 4 directors, 5 directors, and writers like Patty Chayefsky and Rod Serling. It was an incredible opportunity, probably like when sound came to film, but this was even more, because there were silent actors who could work in film. In the live television era, everyone in the movies was under exclusive contract if they were working. Directors, writers, actors. And that meant you couldn't do television because the studios wouldn't let you. And people of any reputation in the theater wouldn't do it because A, it was considered kind of tacky, and B, it didn't pay any money to speak of. So that left this whole medium, this whole extraordinary, quite unique use of the moving image to a bunch of unemployed 25-year-olds, like me and George Scott and Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon and Annie Bancroft and directors like Frank Schaffner and George Roy Hill and Arthur Penn, who sort of got to invent the whole medium, because the networks, being then exclusively radio-oriented, had no idea how to do this. Movie people couldn't do it. The stage people wouldn't do it. So we got to make it up as we went along. It was a fantastic chance. I knew that when I got my first equity job that I was required to join the union, and happy to do so. It qualified me. It was in effect a license to be a professional actor. In those days they had, your first job you had a junior membership, and then after so many weeks of employment in so many different parts, you got a senior membership. I don't think they have that category anymore. And it seemed to me a reasonable thing. I didn't pay much attention to it, really. Once I started working, I was working, and I don't think I was ever even a deputy. Then when television came along, nobody had jurisdiction over television. There was no union. And of course, both Equity and AFTRA and SAG wanted control over it. And that was a battle none of them could win. And for a very brief period, there was, I think it was called the ATA, Association of Television Artists. And we were a tiny group. I don't think there were more than 50 or 60 people in it, and I was doing a lot of television then. And I remember at the time, they said, no, we've got to have a different category, pay scale, for actors who have 5 lines or less. And I said, that's stupid. I said, that just means they'll write all the parts that they can, 5 lines or less. But it passed anyway. But along about that time, AFTRA, then the Association of Radio Artists, and the Screen Actors Guild came to an agreement to split live television and theatrical film, and film television, which really didn't exist at the beginning, between them, and divided the jurisdiction, and that still prevails. I was invited to join the board by then President Ronald Reagan, and then not long after that, I was asked to join the negotiating committee for a strike we were then going through. And I was very impressed by the commitment of the people involved, most particularly Ronald Reagan. He was a superb leader, superb negotiator, always good-humored, always effective, and was responsible for the beginnings of what finally resulted, and I'm proud to have played a tiny part in that. This side of the NBA and the NFL, the best health and welfare agreement in organized labor. And it was, when I first came on the board, we still had a founding member on the board, Leon Ames. And in those days, of course, the union was much smaller then. I don't have the exact figures, but my memory is when I joined SAG, the whole membership was around 8,000. Maybe I wasn't counting. We didn't have that many branches. I think we just had the New York branch, possibly the Chicago branch, but much smaller membership. I believe it's now in excess of 85,000. There have been 2 profound changes since that time. The Screen Actors Guild, in the beginning, was created by some brave stars, guys like Eddie Cantor and Leon Ames and Jimmy Cagney and Frank Morgan, who met secretly, and this is a story the Guild knows. Of course, everybody in the Guild, if they don't know, all know it, they should. because it was a brave thing to do. In a sense, you can say that the stars were invulnerable to pressure from the studios because they were needed, which is true. Nonetheless, it was a gutsy thing to do, and what they did should always be remembered. I was very junior on the board and only peripherally involved in the negotiations, but there was the question of what turned out to be payment for pre-48 movies, pre-1948 movies. And in effect, to establish the pension system and the welfare, the negotiation traded away the rights in those movies, which of course annoyed the older actors in that period. But you were going to have to trade something. And to get ongoing rights for new work, no one at the time really imagined the proliferation of channels and how even old black and whites would still show. But it was, I think overall, it was a good deal. It was certainly regarded as such at the time to establish. The Screen Actors Guild has always been kind of the bellwether, in my opinion, in the film industry, for what all the creative guilds do, what the technical unions do. We always do it first. We're in a stronger position to negotiate. I venture cautiously to say that we perhaps are more regarded as stable negotiators than, say, the writers. I'm going to catch hell from John Milius for that. But in any case, for whatever reasons, the Screen Actors Guild has always been the cutting edge of negotiations. From the very beginning of my time on the board in the Screen Actors Guild, there hardly was a board meeting when the question of merger didn't come up. And when I became president, there was already a committee to examine merger. And there have been countless reports, countless demands for merger. The membership of AFTRA and equity is not involved. And although there is some pressure for having all performers in one union. And it seems like a good idea to the members because they think that it would mean one card, one jurisdiction, thus less dues. It wouldn't. All the studies indicate that merged unions, whether it's two unions merging or three, would result in more dues, higher dues. And in the case of AFTRA, the last survey I saw, many SAG members were very edgy about merging with a union in which so many members are not actors. Weathermen, sports announcers, news commentators, news readers, really don't, acting is not what they do, and they would vastly affect decisions of the union. That was the reason why SAG 3 times rejected merger with the extras, because acting is not what they do. I felt the establishment of the pension and welfare that had taken place was a marvelous thing and was the most useful area to improve. I thought that was a more important issue than wages and working conditions, because the wages and working conditions by that time were pretty good. And there comes a point in wages and working conditions where you get counterproductive. Our wage scales are much higher as it is now and were then than those in other countries. So you have to examine the point where your members are not going to get hired. They will make the picture in Italy or Spain or South America or Mexico or Canada or England, and in part because they can hire actors. Even, I think the English actors are unparalleled in the world. Their pay scale is much smaller than ours, much lower. And I felt that health and welfare were more important. I did and still do object strongly to what I perceive as the politicization of the board. We're a small union, even as we are now, but still, by AFL-CIO, by big labor standards, we're not a big union. But we are useful to big labor because we have high-profile members. And I understood that from the beginning and was uneasy about it. I think a union we must have the highest unemployment rate of any union in organized labor. And that's too bad. Now, it's beyond any control. Nothing could be done to change that. And I think everyone recognizes that. But to become a tool of big labor was never a chore that pleased me. When I was once a delegate to the state AFL-CIO convention, I really became very restive about doing that. Jack Dales, our founding executive director, and I think, in effect, the founding father of the Screen Actors Guild, was still functioning then. Chet Migden was his deputy. And I wanted to go through the experience, but I found it very distasteful. You know, there's a lot of guys in big labor that are really very bad boys. And I think my own opinion is that big labor does not represent the working members of the unions that make it up at all. They are entirely a political organization. And it's unfair, in my opinion, to ask memberships who have diverse beliefs, diverse preferences, to have their dues go to an agenda that they do not share. I'm also distressed by the ease of getting an SAG card now. I think our membership is in the high 80,000s, 80,000 around that, or more even. And clearly there is no conceivable development of the moving image technology that could provide employment for even a fifth of that number, even a tenth, it seems to me. And that's too bad, because that means that the union is primarily thriving on the dues of new members who cannot reasonably expect to get employment. Now, I remember when I was on the board and president as well, every so often a board member would say, you know, we should establish professional standards like architects and lawyers and doctors, and people should have to pass some kind of a test of capacity. And I said, who's going to be on that board? Are you going to sit and tell this actor, no, you don't act well enough to be in the guild? I said, no, I wouldn't be on that board. I don't want that. But at the same time, I think it's sad to encourage people to join, to make it easy for them to join. I got involved in the civil rights movement before it got fashionable in early '61. I did some picketing in Oklahoma and the South, and there was, of course, you see, in the old days, in the studio days, actors were not free to take part in things like this because they were under exclusive contract and they could be forbidden. And such activity could be, and often was, forbidden. It was very rare for actors to take open political positions, especially on controversial issues. And civil rights was highly controversial in the early '60s. And I know when I started doing some picketing around, both allied artists for whom I just finished El Cid, which was would be not released for 6 or 7 months, and I only had one other picture in release. Ben-Hur had come out in '59 and was still playing in many theaters. And both studios said, you know, Chuck, this is really not a good idea. You're going to alienate half you. I said, come on, guys. El Cid isn't going to be out for 6 months. Everyone's seen Ben-Hur anyway. If it's still in theaters, it's for people to see twice. And if they're not going to see it the second time because they don't like that I'm picketing, come on, it's ridiculous. Dr. King came to Los Angeles essentially for a confrontation with YATSE, the technical unions. We had a quick breakfast at the hotel coffee shop. And he said, do you feel, he said, there's a great deal of restriction against black members in the YATSE unions, isn't that right? I said, there are no black members in the YATSE unions, any of them. I said, what's more, there is no one in any of the YATSE unions that is not related to someone who is already a member. I said, that is I said, I couldn't join YATSE. I said, no one who doesn't have a close relative, a father or an uncle, at least, in the YATSE union can be a cameraman or a gaffer or a prop man or a greensman or a makeup man, any of those things. You can't get in. And so that put a different perspective on it for him. And I said, frankly, Dr. King, I don't think you're going to have a lot of luck this morning. Now, it was, in fact, a very civil meeting. And I think the time had come and they knew it. They just weren't prepared to stand up to the kind of pressure he was in a position to bring. Because contrary to my expectations, he got some initial concessions then. And so, of course, that affected not only black applicants, but white applicants who had no relatives in the union. And they all established apprenticeship programs, and they began to accept women, which up to that time, women were only script clerks or hairdressers. That was it. And it was a very rewarding experience. We were a tiny band. I don't think there were more than 25 of us. But it included some high-profile people. Burt Lancaster was there, Marlon, Jimmy Garner, Sidney Poitier, and some writers. James Baldwin flew over from Paris. A lot of people you would expect to be there were not there, and I leave you to figure out who they were. And that's too bad. I don't know whether that defection was lack of commitment or physical anxiety or what, but there were a lot of people that discussed coming and then didn't. It was a busy summer preparing for it. I suppose because of my presidency of the Guild, I was leader or honcho or whatever you want to call it. It was never formalized, but we met here at the house several times. And one of the most passionate members was Marlon, who I suppose predictably saw it as kind of opera And he said, well, we can chain ourselves to the fence in front of the White House and lie down and block Pennsylvania Avenue and block access to the... I said, no, we're not going to do any of that stuff, Marlon. I said, we live in a country where we have the right to peaceful assembly for the redress of grievances. And the key word is peaceful. And I said, if you don't want to do it that way, don't come. And if enough of you decide you do want to do it that way, I ain't going. And so that was that. And it was, I suppose, a shining time. It was a shining time for me. It was marvelous to be there. You know, 20, 30 people, we were nothing. But we probably had a higher percentage of public faces than any of the other groups, who far outnumbered us. And we marched behind Dr. King, and I'm very proud of that. And the better-known members of the group all had separate little chores on the day to do statements and announcements and readings at different parts of the program. And I was to... I guess we were having a group coming down from New York. It wasn't just actors. There were painters and writers. I guess not many painters. Painters tend to stay off and do it by themselves. But some people from New York came down, I don't know, 10 or a dozen. And so we went to meet them at National Airport. And there was a statement I was supposed to read, and I always write my own statements, but they said, you know, Jimmy Baldwin has come over from New York, from Paris, to be part of this, and he's a writer, that's what he does, and he asked if he could write something for somebody, and would it be okay if he wrote your statement? And I said, I'm not so sure of that. I said, for one thing, I write my own statements. For another thing, Jimmy is a pretty radical fella. Which, of course, he was already, in effect, living in exile, the fire next time and all that. And they said, well, we'd be grateful if you'd let him. I said, well, I'll certainly look at it. And to his eternal credit, he understood this implicitly, I think, because he wrote a statement very close to what I would have written myself. And I was proud to read it. And I only met Jimmy on that one day. I never saw him afterwards. He died not very long after that. But I've remained grateful to him. And it was, my wife, Lydia, came with me, and we were supposed to march up near the front because we were standing in the steps of the memorial and all that with Dr. King. And so Lydia wasn't going to get to march with that group. And a lot of people that knew the situation very well, people in the Congress and friends of ours in the FBI and so forth, said, you know, this is a very volatile situation. Why don't you stay and watch it in the hotel room and take pictures from the balcony? And she did that for about 15 minutes, and then she went down and way back in the pack somewhere, she walked next to an old black man with broken shoes. And I think she probably had a better idea of that day than those of us up front with the big birds did. It was a marvelous time. I do remember, too, that the administration was very careful about that. They stayed absolutely clear of any comment about the march. At one point, we were supposed to meet with President Kennedy at the White House, the more visible people involved in the group. And that was reduced to a very quiet, quick meeting between Dr. King and President Kennedy and nobody else, and no press. But it was a great day. And afterwards, 4 months later, the Civil Rights Bill passed, and it's generally been conceded that that march had a significant effect on the passage of that bill, and I'm proud of that too. I'm sorry for some of the ramifications of the successive civil rights bills, as I think Dr. King would have been, but I was very proud to be there. The right to work movement is a very strong one in this country. There are, I think, 19 states that have right to work laws, and the Screen Actors Guild flourishes under them. States like Florida and Texas as offhand examples. The members of those branches get a lot of work because those are right to work states. And that'll change if, for example, the current Congress succeeds in striking down the right to work laws, which is held by constitutionalists to be an unconstitutional infringement of the rights of the individual states. But right to work does not hurt Screen Actors Guild members. Many productions shoot in right to work states using Screen Actors Guild members under Screen Actors Guild laws, and DGA directors, and usually cinematographers who work under the Beck decision. They can do that. And the rest of the crews are work at lower wages. It's impossible for me to justify requiring everyone who works to belong to a union and go along with everything they say. This is, seems to me, a constitutional right of each individual citizen. Coerced universal union membership has not worked in socialist countries. It certainly didn't work in the Soviet Union or the communist countries, and I think the breathing space we have here in this country, where there are right-to-work states, where you can belong to a union, but say, tell me the proportion of my dues that you pay to the AFL-CIO for political purposes, because I don't want you to do that. And that's a perfectly compatible arrangement. It annoys big labor, but it doesn't hurt the union members, and it doesn't hurt the unions. I revere Thomas Jefferson, and not least his statement, the best government is the least government. That goes from the federal government to the leadership of the union. You shouldn't dictate everything that happens to people, in my opinion. I've always felt myself a political independent. Though throughout my voting life, I have voted for, more often, I think, Democrats than Republicans. Guys like Adlai Stevenson and Jack Kennedy. And I guess my epiphany was sort of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. I was shooting a picture upstate in Marysville, which was then quite remote country, up near Stockton. And I had a long drive out to location every morning. And there was only one stop sign the whole way. And it was actually a stop light. And there was one billboard there. This was in the fall of '64. And it was a big blue background with a portrait photograph of Barry Goldwater, who was sort of the sacrificial lamb nominated by the Republican Party to run against the replacer to the martyred president after Jack Kennedy was killed. And Johnson was, of course, then to run for the office he'd inherited. And I was going to vote for Johnson, because I had worked for and voted for Kennedy, and he seemed to be carrying out his program. And there were only 8 words of text on this billboard. It said, "In your heart, you know he's right." And I'd sort of glance at it. And then one day there was a whole truck convoy coming by, and I said, "Son of a bitch, he is right." But as I said, I don't feel so much it's that I've changed. It's that no man could be, for example, nominated by the Democratic Party on Jack Kennedy's campaign platform. "We will go anywhere, bear any burden, pay any price in the defense of liberty." It's changed a bit, or at least so I believe. As a public face, I have access on the Hill. I've often testified, even since I've been off the board, on the tax bill, the 83 tax bill. Both Equity and SAG asked me to testify on that. And it's something I can do that is useful. I've done tours of all kinds for various government groups, which is fine. It's not uninteresting, and you feel you're doing some good. I think one of the most interesting things I did was I chaired an international convention of performers' unions in, as I recall, Amsterdam. Yes, it was. And that, of course, because all these unions were looking to us as to negotiating tactics to achieve rights and privileges and peripheral benefits that they didn't have at all. And we explained how we had attempted to negotiate these things. But the largest union there was the Soviet, I've forgotten what they called it, but the Soviet Union's, the Soviets Union, which represented not only actors in film and stage, but ballet dancers, musicians, journalists, writers. It was a huge union. And of course, it wasn't a union at all. The members had absolutely no input. The leadership had nothing to do with setting working conditions or wage scales for any of these, I guess, hundreds of thousands of members. But it was officially regarded as a union. And I had not worked in the Soviet Union at that time, so I knew nothing about the way they made films. And I had a very interesting lunch with the president of this amalgamation of workers. And I said, how do you go about planning a film? And he described how scripts would come in and they would develop the scripts, much as happens here. And I said, but what procedure do you do to determine which scripts will be made? And he said, if we start to develop a script, we make the film. I said, you can't make all the films of all the scripts. Some of them don't turn out. He said, no, we make them all. That's one of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, I suppose. But that was probably one of the more interesting experiences, because you got the feeling that you were interrelating with actors from all over the world. I've always felt that on a certain level, actors belong to their own country. They are, of course, citizens of their country, but never mind the citizens of the world stuff. They are also members of the actors' nation. You always can talk to an actor from another country, and his feelings, his ideas, the things he wants. His dreams are very similar to yours. I've had a wonderful time pretending to be other people, and I'm grateful for all the people I've worked with, all the people that have given me jobs, the ones I hope still will. I'm going to keep hacking away till I get it right.